There comes a moment in a relationship with a narcissistic wife when the exhaustion is no longer just physical. It becomes deeply emotional and psychological. At first, the signs are subtle. You tell yourself that the tension is temporary, that the criticism is simply part of normal conflict, that if you try a little harder, things will return to harmony. But over time, something inside you begins to change. Every conversation starts to feel like a test you are destined to fail. You carefully measure your words, hoping to avoid another accusation, another sarcastic remark, another moment where your intentions are twisted into something negative. What once felt like a partnership slowly begins to feel like a constant evaluation of your worth. Carl Jung often spoke about the psychological toll of living in an environment where one's inner reality is continually denied. When you are repeatedly told that your feelings are wrong, that your memories are inaccurate, or that your efforts are never enough, your mind begins to carry a quiet but persistent weight. It is the weight of emotional exhaustion. This exhaustion does not arrive dramatically. It creeps in slowly. You begin waking up already tired, not because of lack of sleep, but because your mind anticipates the emotional battles that may come during the day. The home that should feel like a place of safety begins to feel unpredictable. Even moments of calm feel temporary, as if another storm could appear at any second. And so you start to withdraw energy from parts of yourself you once expressed freely. Your laughter becomes quieter. Your confidence becomes cautious. Your willingness to share your thoughts becomes restrained. Not because you have nothing to say, but because experience has taught you that speaking often leads to conflict rather than understanding. This is the quiet damage of prolonged emotional harm. It slowly drains the spirit of a person who once believed that love meant support, respect, and mutual growth. And when a relationship turns your inner world into a battlefield, exhaustion is not weakness. It is the mind's signal that something deeply unhealthy is taking place. After prolonged emotional exhaustion, something even more subtle begins to occur. It is not just your energy that fades, it is your sense of self. The human psyche depends deeply on recognition and respect within close relationships. When those elements disappear, the foundation of self-worth begins to weaken. In the beginning, you may resist the criticism. When a narcissistic wife blames you unfairly or questions your intentions, you might defend yourself. You explain, you clarify, you try to show that you care. But over time, a strange psychological shift can occur. Instead of constantly defending your worth, you begin quietly questioning it. This is one of the most damaging effects of repeated emotional manipulation. When someone continually tells you that you are selfish, insensitive, weak, or incapable, the mind begins to absorb these accusations, not because they are true, but because the human mind naturally searches for patterns and meaning in repeated experiences. Carl Jung often explored the idea that the psyche is deeply shaped by the voices it hears most often. When the dominant voice in your daily life becomes one of judgment rather than understanding, it slowly infiltrates your internal dialogue. Eventually, the criticism that once came from outside begins echoing from within. You may start wondering if you really are the problem. You may replay arguments in your mind late at night, trying to find the mistake you made. Even moments where you did nothing wrong can leave you feeling guilty or inadequate. What makes this process so dangerous is that it rarely happens suddenly. It unfolds gradually, almost invisibly. A confident man can slowly become hesitant. A decisive man can begin doubting his instincts. A man who once trusted his own judgment can start looking to the very person who hurts him for approval. And when a person's sense of worth becomes dependent on someone who constantly withholds respect, the psychological damage runs deep. But there is an important truth that must be remembered. When someone repeatedly tries to convince you that you are less than you are, it often reveals far more about their inner insecurity than it does about your value. As the erosion of self-worth continues, another psychological pattern quietly takes hold. You begin living in a state of constant caution. Every interaction starts to feel like walking across fragile ground, where one wrong step might trigger conflict. This is what many people describe as walking on eggshells. But psychologically, it runs much deeper than that simple phrase suggests. Human beings are naturally expressive. In healthy relationships, we speak freely, laugh openly, and share our thoughts without constantly calculating the emotional consequences. But when you live with a narcissistic partner, expression gradually becomes risky. A simple opinion can be interpreted as criticism. A moment of fatigue can be labeled as laziness. Even silence can be turned into evidence of disrespect. So the mind adapts. It begins to monitor every word before it is spoken. You rehearse conversations in your head, anticipating how they might be misunderstood. You soften your tone, adjust your posture, and sometimes even change your beliefs in an attempt to avoid another confrontation. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of authenticity in the development of the individual psyche. When a person is forced to suppress their natural thoughts and reactions in order to maintain peace, something important is sacrificed. The authentic self begins to retreat behind a protective mask. This mask is not created out of deception, but out of survival. It is the psyche's attempt to reduce emotional danger. Yet the cost of this adaptation is significant. The more you monitor yourself, the less natural your presence becomes. The more you avoid conflict, the more control the other person gains over the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Over time, the home environment becomes tense, even during quiet moments. You may feel relief when your partner is not around, not because you dislike them, but because your mind can finally relax from constant self-monitoring, and that realization can be deeply unsettling. When peace only exists in someone's absence, it forces an uncomfortable question into your awareness. If you cannot be yourself in the place that is supposed to be your home, then you must ask whether you are living in a partnership or simply surviving in a psychological cage. After living for so long in a state of tension, questioning your worth, measuring your words, trying to avoid conflict, something inside you begins to adapt in a very particular way. The human psyche has a remarkable instinct for self-protection. When pain becomes repetitive and unavoidable, the mind often responds by creating emotional distance. At first, this distance is barely noticeable. You may simply find yourself sharing less about your day. Conversations that once felt natural become shorter, more practical, more cautious. Where you once looked for connection, You now look for stability. The goal quietly shifts from feeling close to simply getting through the day without another emotional storm. Carl Jung spoke about the psyche's ability to withdraw energy from places where it is consistently wounded. When the emotional environment becomes hostile or unpredictable, the mind begins to pull back its investment, not because love disappears instantly, but because the soul cannot continuously expose itself to harm without developing defenses. You might notice that arguments affect you differently than they once did. Where you previously tried to explain, to resolve, to repair the misunderstanding, now you feel a strange sense of detachment. Instead of engaging deeply, you observe from a distance. Part of you is still present in the relationship, but another part has quietly stepped back. This emotional withdrawal is often misunderstood. A narcissistic partner may accuse you of becoming cold, distant, or uncaring. But in many cases, what they are witnessing is not indifference. It is emotional fatigue reaching its natural limit. The psyche cannot endlessly offer warmth to someone who consistently responds with contempt or manipulation. Eventually, the mind begins to conserve its emotional energy. The heart stops reaching as far as it once did, and this is where a profound psychological shift begins to emerge. When emotional distance appears, it is often a signal that the inner self is attempting to restore balance and protect its remaining strength. Because when the heart stops fighting for connection, it is often preparing for a deeper realization that survival sometimes requires stepping back from the very place where you once hoped to belong. As emotional distance grows, something else begins to awaken within you, an inner search for peace. This stage is subtle, but it marks a profound psychological turning point. After enduring criticism, confusion, and emotional tension for so long, the mind begins to ask a different kind of question. Not, how do I fix this? But, why am I living this way? At earlier stages of the relationship, much of your energy was directed outward. You tried to understand her reactions, her moods, her accusations. You tried to adapt, to improve, to restore harmony. But as time passes and the same patterns repeat, the psyche slowly shifts its attention inward. Carl Jung believed that moments of deep discomfort often force the individual into a process of reflection. When external stability disappears, the mind begins searching internally for clarity and meaning. This is the beginning of psychological awakening. You may start noticing how calm you feel when you are alone or away from the constant tension. Perhaps you find yourself thinking more deeply during quiet moments, while driving, walking, or sitting in silence. Your mind begins comparing two emotional states: the peace you experience when you are free from conflict, and the anxiety you feel when you return to the same destructive dynamic. This comparison becomes difficult to ignore. Something inside you starts recognizing that peace is not a luxury, it is a psychological necessity. The human spirit cannot thrive in a permanent atmosphere of criticism, manipulation, and emotional instability. You begin asking questions that once seemed too uncomfortable to face. Is this relationship helping me grow or slowly breaking me down? Is love supposed to feel like constant tension? And perhaps most importantly, why have I accepted a life where my inner peace feels so rare? These questions are not signs of weakness. In many ways, they represent the mind reclaiming its ability to think clearly again after a long period of emotional confusion. Because the moment a person begins seriously searching for peace, something powerful has already changed inside them. And once the mind truly recognizes the value of peace, it becomes very difficult to continue accepting a life that constantly destroys it. After the mind begins searching for peace, a realization slowly forms that can no longer be ignored. It is not an impulsive thought, nor is it born from anger. Instead, it emerges quietly after months or even years of emotional strain. For the first time, you begin to consider the possibility of walking away. This moment often surprises people. Many assume that leaving a painful relationship happens suddenly, during a dramatic argument or a breaking point filled with emotion. But psychologically, the decision usually develops long before any external action takes place. It begins as a quiet awareness that something fundamental in the relationship cannot be repaired through effort alone. Carl Jung often spoke about the process of individuation, the moment when a person begins reclaiming their own psychological integrity. In difficult relationships, that integrity is often sacrificed in small pieces over time. You compromise your voice, your boundaries, and sometimes even your sense of reality in order to maintain peace. But eventually, the psyche begins demanding its balance back. When that realization arrives, the question changes once again. Earlier you asked how to make the relationship work. Later you asked why you were living in constant tension. Now the question becomes even more profound. What kind of life am I willing to accept for myself? At this stage, the idea of walking away is not simply about escaping conflict. It is about restoring dignity, emotional stability, and the freedom to exist without constant psychological pressure. You begin imagining a life where your words are not twisted, where your intentions are not constantly doubted, and where peace is not something you only experience in brief moments of solitude. Of course, this realization is not easy. Leaving a long relationship carries fear, uncertainty, and deep emotional complexity. But there is also something powerful hidden within this moment. It is the rediscovery of self-respect. And when a person finally understands that their well-being is worth protecting, a quiet strength begins to replace the exhaustion they once carried. Because the moment you truly accept that your peace matters, you take the first step toward a life where your soul no longer has to survive. It can finally begin to live again.